Welcome to the Young Justice Podcast. This is Zach Rhoads. We talk about our opiate crisis, which in many ways is a misnomer. Indeed, we do have a drug death epidemic. However, we know that at least 75% of drug deaths involving opioids happen as a result of mixtures of drugs, usually sedatives like alcohol or benzodiazepines, or by people using unpure heroin, sometimes unknowingly, typically synthetic opioids like fentanyl. So I guess it just becomes curious why we call this an opiate crisis at all. Why not call it a sedative crisis or a mixed drug crisis? I prefer to call it what it is, an epidemic of drug-related deaths. That alone is not so much the problem as is this bizarre notion that everybody is equally vulnerable to becoming addicted or to using drugs destructively enough to kill themselves by doing so. Now, this just isn't true, and I don't mean this as any sort of hyper-partisan political statement, but statistically, it's just not true. Drug addiction and drug death does not affect everybody equally. And actually, we have a good idea about who addiction and drug deaths do affect. Understanding this is going to help us create reasonable and effective treatment. My guest today is going to talk about all of this, is Dr. Stanton Peele. Stanton has been much more than just an expert that I can call on when I need to interview somebody. He has become a mentor, a colleague, and when I have questions for him, he will answer. And when I challenge him, he entertains the back and forth until he either convinces me or we agree to disagree, and it's usually the former. Now, Stanton is often described as cantankerous, or generally very curt, and I do understand why people might think so, but just know this is not at all my experience with him. Stanton has been correctly theorizing about addiction for 40 years. He has sat back and watched as culture around him slowly realizes that what he's been saying all along is correct. So all things considered, I think he's actually rather diplomatic. He just has a low tolerance for bullshit. You might liken him to a climate scientist in today's world. So anyway, I asked him to be on the show to describe some of the things that he's been writing about and some of the things that he and I have been having conversations about lately. This conversation lasts long enough and is loaded with content that I decided to release it as two parts. So it's a part 1 and 2, and part 1 is just a general debunking of cultural shibboleths around addiction, and then part 2 is going to be all about MAT, or medication-assisted treatment. But I will tell you more about that at the end of this episode. For now, please enjoy my talk with a pioneer in the field of addiction. This is Dr. Stanton Peele. Well, hey, folks, back for round 2 on the podcast is Dr. Stanton Peele. Stanton, thanks for coming back to the show.
It's great to be back, Zach. We're really going to get down to the nitty-gritty tonight.
Well, I hope so. And listen, I'm beyond excited to do it. And for those of you who don't know, Stanton was among my very first wave of well-known guests that were on the show, some with whom I've kept contact, but especially Stanton, who has challenged me to tap into my expertise and interest in human development and sort of apply that to my research and writing in the addiction field. So that's what we'll talk about today. So Stanton, so that this could be a standalone podcast for people who haven't tuned into our last talk, I think that it's going to be important for people to understand your definition of addiction. So why don't we do that? What is addiction?
Well, we can start with the definition of addiction, and actually most people recognize it pretty readily, certainly most clinicians. It's when a person becomes entangled in an involvement of any sort in such a way that it degrades the rest of their lives. And yet, for some reason, they're unable to separate themselves from that involvement. And they maintain that involvement, or they become even more deeply enmeshed in it, in what is kind of a paradigm case of addiction, where people reach a point of insanity or death Now, two large caveats. The standard addiction model has two elements. And most people recognize in real life that those elements aren't present, and therefore they're reluctant to call addictions addictions. And those two elements are that most addictions are self-ameliorating. Most people, for example, who tend to get involved in wayward romantic relationships, to go overboard with them, as they get older, they form more mature connections. Most people who smoke will eventually, and by the way, the research shows smoking is among the hardest addictions to quit, harder than, taking longer on average, than alcohol, cocaine, or marijuana. But still, most people quit. When they become parents, most often, or as they get older and they become worried about their health. That's true about heroin and cocaine as well. And so people think what I know to be addiction, relationships I see or involvements I see, well, that can't be addiction. Because I know from watching television and from listening to AA and from hearing about the brain disease model that people can't get over addictions. Ergo, what I know is not addiction. And what needs to take place is that we make the exact opposite transference. There was a very specific place that occurred, by the way. DSM, one miracle of modern terminology and classification is DSM is the psychiatric manual. DSM-5 refers to one thing as addictive, one thing in the whole universe. It's not a drug and it's not alcohol, it's not cigarettes. There are 14 or 17, I think, categories of drugs. And they vary from mild to moderate to severe substance use disorders. The only thing that DSM-5 calls addictive is gambling. Mm-hmm. And they went through a whole rigmarole talking about sex addiction. And it gets a little psychotic. The head of the group is Charles O'Brien, one of the leading psychiatrists in the field. And he said, sexual connections don't produce the right brain waves, so they can't be addictions. And every clinician worth his or her salt says, well, I know people who've been addicted to sex. I mean, in the same way they've been addicted to cigarettes or alcohol, where they pursue it endlessly despite its negative consequences. And what you see is they're intimidated mostly from saying, well, you're wrong about defining addiction, because I know what addiction is. That's addictive from my own experience. And if some clinicians have a lot of experience with that. And they're told, oh, you can't call that an addiction. Now, this is all part of one big caveat, which is people know what addictions are. Addiction is a term that's been used throughout history. It was grabbed by the medical establishment and reified into a medical concept with characteristics that, in fact, it doesn't possess. The second caveat is that addiction can never be defined biologically. In Europe, there's a concept that most well-educated people understand called reductionism. That idea is that things exist at different levels of reality and can only be understood and worked at that level. Mm. There's a social level. You can't reduce social phenomena to psychology. You can't reduce Donald Trump getting elected to individual psychology. Right. It's something that occurs at a group level. You can't reduce individual psychology to biology. There's too many things going on in individuals' lives, their thoughts, their interactions to accomplish that. But in America, we're forever indebted to that pursuit. So that in America, to say something, to make any kind of claim that something is biological or to deal with anything in biological terms is a great plus. People think, oh my God, that's real science. But in fact, science is the matter of describing a phenomenon accurately in a way that you can deal with it. And that last caveat is kind of going to be the theme of what we're going to talk about. We've been enmeshed in it for a century, really. I mean, people, American medicine and medicine worldwide commandeered the addiction concept around the turn of the previous century, around the 1900s. And it's never let go of them. Never let go of the concept. And now we're enmeshed in that pursuit, such that somebody like Nora Volkow operates entirely at the level of symbols. She does research with MRIs and brain scans that show activity around addiction, but not one human being in the world, is diagnosed or treated in terms of brain scans or brain manipulation.
Right.
If somebody comes in and they do a brain scan, they say, oh my God, your brain gets really energized by taking cocaine. That means nothing. They still say, well, are you going out and purchasing a lot of cocaine? Are you skipping work? Is your wife leaving you? They use the symptoms, which are defined, by the way, in DSM-5. DSM-5 has it's crazy in some ways, and it has its compensations in others. And that's what addiction is. And Nora Volkow is somebody who's made her room and board. She was appointed to the NIDA, chief of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, in 2003. As we're going to discuss, I think, shortly, by every measurement of drug and alcohol consumption, and people regularly announce that we're experiencing epidemics. And you might say, well, if somebody's in charge of the agency that's supposed to deal with that, and everything is at epidemic levels since she began, because these jumps all began right around the time that she began her tenure, isn't that a problem for her? And the answer is no. People will say, is she even spreading her model worldwide, where people say, she's so scientific. She's relating things to brain scans. The fact that those brain scans can't be related to actual behavior in an ongoing, predictive way that's useful for treatment. Volkow has not developed one treatment. The NIDA has no brain treatments for addiction. But that doesn't worry them, and it doesn't worry most people. They say, well, yes, but they're finding the source of addiction in the brain. So with that kind of a grounder in what addiction is, why most people sort of understand what addiction is, why they're intimidated away from comprehending what addiction is and approaching it in a realistic way as individuals or as clinicians, is because we have a kind of a scientism, a worship at the manual of what people think of as being science, which is worse than useless. It's incredibly dysfunctional. It's an addiction of its own in the sense that we're wedded to it. We won't let go of it. It's got its tentacles all around us, despite what everybody acknowledges to be the ever-increasing negative consequences of that thing that we're dealing with.
Okay, I think that's going to give us a perfect foundation to work from. You wrote an article, Our Drug Epidemic is Worse Than Ever. And I want to just sum it up. I'll let you run with it, but just to sum up what I gather from it, in the article, you describe a perverse and political outlook on our country's drug death crisis. And what you describe is that people are clinging really tightly to these kind of nested political ideologies that we spend a lot of time and energy on, even though not only are they not helping, but they're further accelerating the problem. And so you allude to a New York Times analysis by Josh Katz, where he puts an exclamation point on the rising drug death crisis and zeroes in on, I think, Ohio and Akron. You give 5 reasons why this Times article is exactly an example of the kind of sentiment fueling the already wrong-headed conception of addiction, because it gets us into this crisis mode so that we address the problem with panic, and that is kind of the source of the drug epidemic in the first place. So I would love to go over your top 5 reasons from the article that Times piece is doing more harm than good.
The first thing that we need to point out is the Times is addicted to a terminology which is nonsensical. It's never made sense, and it's more irrelevant than ever. They use the term overdose. The Times did. Nora Volkow entered the fray, became head of the NIDA in 2003, Around 2002, we started seeing a skyrocketing of drug-related deaths. Heroin purity hasn't increased since the 1990s, and yet heroin deaths have skyrocketed, synthetic narcotic deaths have skyrocketed, tranquilizer deaths have skyrocketed. Overall, between 2002 and 2015, in those dozen years, there was 350% increase in drug-related deaths. It became a major phenomenon in the United States of America. Now, the Times did a great article. We've employed every technique that we know. Obviously, AA's been around for all this time, and NA. The United States is a very heavily treated society. It's not that there's not a lot of treatment programs around, although the treatment programs have never demonstrated they're successful, and people are not particularly drawn to them. I mean, you would think the logic would be if drug addiction is, so I just heard a program the other day, 2 days ago on PBS, where in New York City they were saying, well, we have a lot of good programs in Staten Island, but right now out of 120 beds, only 35 are occupied. And you have to ask yourself, well, why if we have such great treatment and people find addiction so horrifying, why don't more people take advantage of treatment, even public provided treatment?
Yep.
So that one thing that they tell us, we need to have more treatment slots. The treatment slots we have are already unsuccessful, and they already often go unfilled. The second thing is they're calling them overdose deaths, which leads into a whole other thing that we'll talk about further down the trail, I hope. People can't die of taking heroin. There's no such thing as a heroin overdose. I like to begin my lectures by saying everything you believe is false, so just tell me anything you believe is not true. When they were able to do laboratory experiments, they were able to jack people up 50 and 100 times their normal doses of heroin. People didn't die. A lot of people didn't even show changes in their respiration or heartbeat. Heroin's opiates are kind of remarkable drugs. People die from infections, including, AIDS, of course, and heart muscle infections from impure needles and other abscesses and other health problems. Those are people who are on the street. And people die what's generally labeled as overdose from mixing drugs. They mix alcohol, amphetamines, cocaine, and heroin. I do a quiz. What did Philip Seymour Hoffman die from? Philip Seymour Hoffman had heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, and tranquilizers in his system when he died.
Mm-hmm.
So that calls into question the whole idea even of a heroin addiction. If somebody's addicted to heroin, why are they taking all those other drugs? And the correct label, the source of drug deaths is better termed when either chaotic drug use or self-destructive, intentionally almost self-destructive drug use. So we're going to talk, if you gave people pure heroin in clean injection form, they wouldn't die. They wouldn't die. So in a safely administered spot, they won't die of it. So we can't even label the problem correctly. We imagine people have these enormous heroin habits and they're killing them. And so we're fighting a shibboleth, we're fighting a chimera that doesn't exist. So that's just two things to start with. We need more treatment slots so that we can do what? More of what's been failing us all along.
Mm-hmm.
Two, we need to stop people from taking heroin, or they're dying from too pure heroin. The third, fourth, and fifth shibboleths, which are inescapably untrue and critical to know they're untrue, but we can never know that they're not true, is that people love to say there's no social impact on addiction. We've been selling this line for 50 years. AA sold it. There's no social dimension in addiction. Everybody's equally likely to get addicted. The most fundamental thing we know is that that's false. And I use an example to kind of illustrate that. So you think that former President Obama's daughters are just as likely to become drug addicted as people growing up in inner city Baltimore or in the Appalachians outside of Wheeling, West Virginia, where their families have long ago given up hope on life, where they have no chance of going to school, where their entire neighborhood is decimated, where crime and violence are rampant, where so many people in their community and their relations are already, their lives are completely encumbered by drugs, compared to, say, the Obama girls who are just going to some good school, have a nice, stable household. I know the older daughter's going to Harvard, but she's taking a year off going to Portugal first. That doesn't guarantee that your life's going to be perfect, but it is 99% of the way up the ladder to making sure that you avoid the worst forms of addiction, or in the occasional case when you do become addicted, your chances of overcoming it in that kind of a milieu are remarkably better. And so we're busy selling a medical model which slices all of the sense out of what we know in life, what's commonsensical, and what we most ought to be doing and need to be doing. But we don't know how to do it. We can't do it. And in a way, we've given up doing it, which is giving everybody some kind of a life worth living and a chance to get ahead in society. We could talk more about that social dimension. And the last, I mean, if I left anything out, pin me on it. But sure. Regarding, it's related to all these other three things. By regarding addiction as a purely biological phenomenon, by saying, well, addiction is a brain mechanism, it's a chronic brain disease, that causes addiction, we are at a sea to understand everything that I just described, the massive social differences in addiction, the fact that most people overcome addiction, usually on their own without treatment, the fact that most of our disease-oriented treatment is minimally to none at all successful, the fact that the more treatment and medically oriented paradigms we provide, the more rampant and uncontrollable our drug and addiction outcomes are. Let me just throw in one other statistic. We talked about the 350% increase, and the fact the Times had an article saying that increase hasn't stopped in 2015 when the last data were supposedly available. If anything, drug deaths have sharply increased since what we thought was an all-out red flag alarm in 2015 to even greater heights in 2017. And one other thing, which is lost in the shuffle, there's a massive national survey called NESARC, which measures alcohol and drug use. In 2002, 2003, when NESARC has numbers too, like DSM, the first NESARC found 8.5% of people had a substance use and alcohol use disorder. In 2012 to 13, they found that 14% had an alcohol use disorder in the past year. That's a 50% climb. We're drinking worse than ever. And those things have consequences. Part of the research shows that being diagnosed with an alcohol use disorder is accompanied by two major things: it's psychological distress and impairment of your life, medical, job, familial impairment. So by every measure we have, the things that we're most concerned about, drugs and illicit drugs and alcohol use, are getting worse. Let me I don't know if this Times article, the New York Times follows the paradigm in describing prescription drug painkiller addiction. The story they tell, which is a story that goofy governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, tells, you have a normal person, they are prescribed painkillers, they become addicted to them, they die. That's the paradigm and the New York Times tells it every time it writes an article. That virtually never happens. Almost Never happens. It's 1 in tens of thousands of people who are prescribed painkillers, who have a normal prescription and are supervised by a physician, who die.
Aren't the people who are that small percentage who are becoming addicted to legitimate pain prescriptions, probably a lot of them have had previous bouts of addiction, right?
You think that more? Who do you think are getting addicted by prescription?
Well, I think people getting addicted by prescriptions are people getting prescriptions from the streets, from their friends, from relatives who aren't prescribed to them. But I think, but what I'm saying is, even among the small percentage of people who are getting addicted from a legitimate prescription, I would guess that they already had been experiencing addiction.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, it's easier to predict addiction based on a person's past life than on the drugs they're taking. Let me give you an example where that was found. Everybody says the same thing about the Vietnam War data, which I refer to in Love and Addiction. Most of the addicted veterans in Vietnam ceased to be addicted when they came home, 93%. Here's 2 more remarkable things that are everything everybody believes about drugs and addiction are wrong. Half of those men did use heroin or a street narcotic when they returned home. Nonetheless, only of that group, 15% became re-addicted. The drug itself is a minor part in the equation. Your environment is the other thing. Is by far the greater determinant of your likelihood of being addicted.
Right.
Lee Robbins did that research. She's a sociologist at Washington University. Here's what she said. People were no more likely, because she was studying the Vietnam veterans when they returned home, a large sample. People were no more likely to use heroin on a regular basis once they began using it than marijuana, amphetamines, or barbiturates. People don't use barbiturates anymore, but in other words, heroin is no more addictive than any other street drug. And then she said something that we probably wouldn't tolerate now. We should put quotations around the word worse. Heroin is a worse addiction only because, in quotation marks, worse people use it. And by worse, what she meant is what you've just been saying. People with proclivities towards addictive, not able to engage in life and who tend to become addicted are those who are more likely to end up in the heroin barrel or the painkiller addiction wheelbarrow. And we constantly make the mistake of labeling that, attributing that to the drug rather than to the human being and their environment. And we'll never solve addiction that way. We'll never improve its outcomes. We'll never improve how we deal with drugs as long as we have those miscomprehensions about addiction. And those misapprehensions are becoming worse all the time. As I pointed out in regard to that article, the very hysteria surrounding all of these issues about drugs. And, you can understand why people are getting somewhat upset when death rates go up. That hysteria makes it less likely, we're more likely to demonize drugs based on that than we are to understand what the actual causes of addiction are in terms of how we raise children, in terms of how we put them in school, in terms of how we deal with communities, in terms of even what treatment looks like. If you can't reorient your understanding of addiction to understand those drivers, the personal and situational drivers, we have no chance of addressing them. And that's why in any other circumstance, we would say, we're doing pretty badly right now in addressing drug-related outcomes and alcohol use disorders. What is it we should do? And the answer we basically have come up with is, well, let's do more of what we've been doing.
Yeah. Well, you talk about how we're just overhyping the problem, unable to talk about solutions rationally. How should we start talking about things rationally? I mean, you've talked about how we should probably pivot to talk about really the underlying causes if we're up for reduction of any kind. There are lifestyle causes of addiction that we can sum up why someone is addicted much better than which drug they're taking. But how should a lay person start to do this?
If you're a clinician or if you're an educator, the first thing you do is examine a human being's life. I mean, so again, all of this wisdom, this hidden wisdom, is a part of what we know. There's something called high-risk children. Everybody in the school system knows what a high-risk child is. He's somebody who, comes from a bad social environment, a bad neighborhood, who has a bad family background, bad meaning, the family's disorganized or criminal or has drug problems already. That child doesn't get engaged in school. That child doesn't form positive relationships with other people. That child doesn't develop a positive relationship with the community. Those are the things that predict addiction. You can have all the drug education classes you want. If you don't address those factors, you do nothing. Let's jump to treatment. Treatment reflects the same set of issues. You can't cure addiction in the absence of understanding a person's entire life setting. It can't be done. And any clinician tries to do it. Even clinicians who are totally biologically oriented make a stab at it. They'll certainly ask a person, well, where do you live? Do you have a stable home environment? Are you married or do you have a partner? Do you have a way of making a living? How's your overall health? How do you feel about yourself? Are you a part of the community? These are the elements of a complete life. And by the incorrect, you might almost say insane analogy of an addiction to something like an infectious disease or like cancer, people throw all of those things overboard when they approach somebody with an addiction. And which leads to, I know you've been talking to many people about this issue. Sally Satel has been one of the great leaders in saying they'll never come up with an inoculation, a drug inoculation for addiction, which they always talk about. Well, we'll have a drug that blocks the effects of cocaine so that people can never become addicted to cocaine. But Sally doesn't have a whole formulation of what's on the other side of that equation. Sally's good at describing why that makes no sense. It won't succeed. The data show it won't succeed. It's never succeeded. She doesn't have a fully developed structure on the other side of that divide to say, here's why a drug can't cure an addiction. Because an addiction encompasses a person's entire life. If you're not capable of addressing the key drivers of that person's life in a positive way, you have no opportunity to impact their addiction. And that's, in a nutshell, what's wrong with addiction treatment in general, and B, now the new surge to create medication-assisted treatment as an answer to the addiction problem. We're now in an MAT surge. What's great about MAT from the marketing standpoint, by the way, Vivitrol, which is long-acting naltrexone, you can't ride the subways in New York without being confronted with MAT. Vivitrol is long-acting naltrexone. No systematic clinical study has ever found naltrexone to have an enduring effect greater than, for either drugs or alcohol, placebo. 3 years ago in the JAMA Psychiatry, Charles O'Brien, a man I mentioned already, who declared gambling the one thing in the universe that's addictive, did a really systematic study of naltrexone versus placebo. And it had a genetic typing component to it because they have a delusion that it's genetically determined.
Right.
All four groups, all genetic subtypes, placebo and naltrexone, showed exactly the same drop in drinking. It was an alcohol-based study. They dropped the amount they drank right after the first trial They dropped how frequently they drank. They even reported exactly the same drops. In fact, the lowest of the four groups was one of the placebo groups in your urge to drink, in the craving for alcohol. So that's naltrexone is a blocking drug. It enables you. It supposedly blocks opiate receptors. So the claim that it was effective for alcohol, which is made all over the place. Balcovin is one version of that, which has been, marketed by Radiolab, had a whole program saying, it began with something like, is there a cure for alcoholism that we always had, but we just ignored? What a crazy idea. And ironically, the woman who was presenting this was a professor of psychiatry at Penn. She might have gone down the hallway to talk to Charles O'Brien about the failure of the naltrexone genetic cross-cutting efficacy trial that produced zero add-on benefit. Now, naltrexone is a drug that blocks narcotic effects of receptors, but it's been proven no more successful for long-term abstinence from narcotics than placebo.
I wonder if, in the long run, I mean, I don't know how longitudinal these studies were, but in the long run, if it isn't part of the reason our death rates are skyrocketing because of drugs like this.
Exactly. There's a global commission on tobacco run out of Harvard. They were great purveyors of nicotine replacement therapy, Nicorettes or patches. They did a long-term study of people who quit smoking on their own or by NRT, nicotine replacement therapy. They found no difference between the two groups, except the more dependent that you were on nicotine, the more likely you were to relapse if you went the NRT versus quitting on your own route. Now, this is an example. If you're enmeshed, if you're locked in the idea of the biology of addiction and medicating it, that's baffling. If you just talk common sense, you say to somebody, well, people who quit on their own are less likely to relapse when they're highly dependent than people who use a drug or a nicotine replacement to quit. Why is that? It's because at some point in their lifetimes, and usually sooner rather than later, a year, 2 years, these studies were done over 3 years. The Harvard World Commission on Tobacco. They're going to quit using the nicotine replacement, or they're going to forget it one time, or they won't get to the drugstore. And now they're like Dumbo, who thinks the only reason he can fly is because he's got that feather in his trunk. They believe that's the source of their ability to quit. So that's a monumental study that was conducted by a critical group on a drug treatment that far exceeds anything. A lot more people have used nicotine gum, Nicorette, than will ever use Vivitrol or naltrexone.
And that gets us into the more contentious issue, because you will extrapolate slightly to methadone and buprenorphine for opiate addictions. Now, I think what you're saying is that these kinds of medications for addiction, they can be cashed out in the form of harm reduction, okay, but the same way that you're talking about these studies, they may do more harm than good in the long run. Is that right?
You put that very well. I mean, what's dangerous about they advertise Vivitrol in the subways, and they advertise naloxone. Naltrexone is a long-term blocking effect. Naloxone is a short-term blocking effect, and it affects any of a range of narcotic or depressant drugs. And naloxone brings people back to life. You do inject people who are people die mainly when they double down on depressant drugs by asphyxiation because of the failure of their brain to be able to drive their breathing apparatus.
Right.
and it reverses that effect. So there's ads all over the subway, and they have in Spanish and English. I just took the subway home saying my mother, my best friend, my husband, my lover was saved by naloxone. So, I mean, you'd have to be like Adolf Hitler to be against naloxone. I mean, who could be against it? It brings people back from the dead. Of course, you have to be undergoing a coma-like experience before it's utilized. So it's not a treatment. I mean, it's a treatment for dying. The drugs that are used to treat that have also shown positive overall impact on death rates are buprenorphine and methadone. And they're, unlike naloxone and naltrexone, which are blocking agents, they're substitute narcotics.
Right. So
and I want to go harken back to something that we began a while ago talking about. People don't die from heroin. So before we go into MAT, there's actually something called HAT, which is heroin-assisted treatment,
right,
which is practiced nowhere in the United States. However, Seattle has just approved the concept of starting some heroin maintenance clinics. And now there's two variations of that we don't have to get into, which is where you allow people to inject the heroin and they might measure the heroin for its purity. An actual maintenance clinic is one where they provide the heroin, clinical grade heroin. Nobody has ever died at an HAT facility. Not one person.
Where they're giving pure heroin.
Where they're getting pure heroin and a clean needle. Nobody. So if you actually, one thing that one depressed, I have a theory. We don't actually, and I hate to say this, it sounds cruel, we don't care if people die. We only want to protect our paradigms, our way of thinking. And I can prove that scientifically. I lived in the state of New Jersey when we had a liberal governor, Christine Whitman. She appointed an AIDS commission, and a man named Rhoads, who had no background in public health, was made the head of it. And he did his research, and he said, well, we need to provide clean needles. That's how people get AIDS. This is the primary way. That's not primarily, that's how they primarily were getting AIDS after the initial gay epidemic. And people said, well, you can't give people clean needles, which isn't giving them heroin, but it's sort of saying, well, look, we know you're taking heroin. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is a famous health research factory. It's in New Jersey. They were the first organization to find that people who underwent clean needle programs were not more likely to maintain their heroin habit. They were less likely.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you think about heroin addiction as a biological imperative, well, once you're taking heroin, you can't stop, then that makes no sense to you. If you talk in common human terms and you say, well, if you're going to a facility and you're talking to a healthcare worker, if you're taking care of yourself, if you're saying, well, I'm taking heroin, but at least I don't want to get AIDS, I don't want to get an infection in my heart, I want to try and preserve my life. And you're talking to somebody who says, well, I used to take heroin, but I stopped taking heroin. And then the person goes, oh, you mean you can quit heroin? The person says, I did. We have some programs. Then you understand why that's logical. But Christine Whitman rejected that concept. And Trost, who wasn't a public health guy, did a calculation of how many lives it would save a year to have a clean needle program. He came up with 660 lives a year. Instead of being the first state in the union to have a clean needles program, New Jersey became the last state in the union. Totally to Christine Whitman. That's 11 times. So over 7,000 people died because of Christine Whitman. But Christine Whitman you can see her not only on, you can see her on MSNBC. They talk to her as a kind of the moderate liberal Republican, somebody who believes in climate change. Ethan Edelman and others have pointed out the United States delayed throughout the 1990s implementing clean needle programs when they were implemented everywhere else in the Western world, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths. One of the greatest opponents to clean needle programs, of course, were the Clintons. If you remember their crazy drug czar, who you see all the time on television now. He's a military commentator. He was totally against them. We killed hundreds of thousands of people. If you multiply 7,000 in New Jersey by 50 states, that's 350,000 people. Because we wanted to show how much we hated drugs. We believe so much in the medicalization of addiction, the biology of addiction, that we ignored the clearest way to save people's lives. And nobody has paid a price for that. Not Christine Whitman. Nobody who ever was against that crazy drug czar of the Clintons. Nobody has ever paid any price for that. Because, I'll say it again, we don't really care if people die. We just don't want to upset our apple cart. And if you believe that model, then you'll understand why we're continuing to pursue the same approaches that have led to more and more deaths.
Okay, I'm going to pull the brakes right here because I think this is a perfect place to end part 1. From here until the end of our talk in part 2, it's all about the nuances of medication-assisted therapy and its efficacy. So tune in soon for part 2 with Dr. Stanton Peele.